Hi, this is Richard Edelman, and you're listening to The Trust Makers.
Hi, I'm Andrea Hagelgans, Managing Director of U.S. Social Issues Engagement at Edelman. We're joined today by Erika Soto Lamb, Vice President of Social Impact Strategy of MTV Entertainment Group. Erika leads campaigns for global Paramount brands, including MTV, Comedy Central, VH1, Smithsonian Channel, and Pop. In 2020, she co-founded Power the Polls, which was the first national campaign to recruit a new generation of poll workers. Prior to joining MTV Entertainment Group, Erika was the founding Chief Communications Officer at Everytown for Gun Safety, where she helped build the country's largest gun violence prevention organization. Erika, welcome to the Trust Makers.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrea.
So thank you so much for joining us, Erika. Obviously, we've been friends forever. I would love for our listeners to learn a little bit about your career path and how you became involved in corporate social impact.
Yeah, well, I think the through line of my career, from starting in political campaigns just out of college to working in a corporate environment now, and everything in between, has been doing good from whatever position or place of power that I'm working in to make people's lives better at the end of the day. And so whether in politics or at a big media and entertainment company, or for the many, many clients from the private sector or nonprofits that I had during my years working in public affairs agencies, I've been telling stories and creating programs or creating campaigns and partnerships to do that. And I feel so lucky to have been able to do that kind of work. As you said, the story of my career is, starting in politics, but has evolved to figure out different ways to create change and create a better world and make people's lives better through now in a corporate environment where I get to work with brands and shows and talent to do just that on the many pressing social issues that we're all facing.
So I'm curious, as the founding head of social impact strategy at Comedy Central, what was it like being the first person in your role?
Yeah, I really love being the first person or an early part of a team to build a strategy to create change. And I was really grateful to have become the first head of social impact for Comedy Central. Though it wasn't the first time I helped to build a team and a plan for how to do good. I had been the founding head of communications at Everytown for Gun Safety and Moms Demand Action before that. And, really loved being able to understand a problem and explore the many different ways that we could tackle it and build the plan and the team of people to do that effectively. My founding role at Everytown came after having worked for one of my clients at the time of the Sandy Hook shooting was an organization called Mayors Against Illegal Guns, which was the predecessor entity to Everytown and Moms Demand Action. And when that, tragic event occurred, we realized we needed to make a new plan and build a movement of people to say, we don't want to live this way. We want to feel safe in our communities, and that every town should be free of gun violence. And in that, an issues-focused organization and advocacy role, I began to see how, even though a lot of my career to that point had been very focused on a political or a policy strategy and using the tactics of that work, from polling to press conferences and research and white papers, that when we were able to employ partnerships with brands and cultural strategies, we could reach a whole new group of people. And that was really what led me to work for Comedy Central as an entertainment brand and to figure out how to leverage comedy to create change on social issues. So Comedy Central had never had this role before, but is a sister brand to MTV, which I now gratefully do work on behalf of as well. But at the time, they collaborated with their sister brand to understand the legacy of a company and a brand that had been working in social issues for decades, really one of the first brands to put a flag out to activate young people around social issues like voting and LGBTQ and race issues, and brought me on, given the background that I had in social issues advocacy, to think about how to leverage comedy, and was grateful that in my first 90 days on the job had the opportunity to speak with the senior leadership of the Comedy Central team at the time and to survey our audience. I think for the first time, we test our shows, we test our campaigns with audience, but never before had we figured out a way to test our audience to understand what they cared about and what they were ready to hear and see a brand like Comedy Central, the number one brand in comedy, take on. And we settled on, after those first 90 days and some really great research, mental health as a social issue priority that continues to be something that we know comedy can help to address and can help lead people to support for their emotional well-being, that I'm glad to continue to do as a part of my role at the MTV Group.
It's so interesting. I think when you and I were originally coming up in communications, the expectations were always that nonprofits would lead on these social issues, but there wasn't really a role for business nor an expectation. But yet our Edelman Trust Barometer research shows now that people really do expect companies and brands to speak out and take action on social and geopolitical issues. Why do you think there's been this turning point?
Yeah, Andrea, I feel grateful that you and I have worked in a lot of similar environments, from politics to social issues, and now in working with companies and brands. And I can't tell you how many times in my career I have referenced the Edelman Trust Barometer as part of building the business case for why it's imperative for companies to be taking on social issues work, and how that is, addressing a double bottom line of doing good in the world, which, as I said earlier, has been a North Star of the work that I've been lucky to do in my career, but is also good for business, given the changing points of view of consumers, to expect that the companies that they line up with, that they buy products from, whose shows they watch, whose books they read, whose podcasts they listen to, are doing good in the world, and how significant that's changed from, say, the baby boomer generation, where, brands and companies wouldn't touch social issues with a 6-foot pole. They were, considered a third rail to get into anything quote unquote political. To younger consumers, and particularly Gen Z, really putting their money where their mouth is, and spending based on brands that they feel share their social values. So I found that to be a really exciting opportunity for companies and brands, and the ones that I've had the opportunity to work with and for now, to see what is our role, to ask ourselves, what can we do, what feels right for us, and lead the way there, and then show how those campaigns have been beneficial to our standing as a brand and as a company, and really feed the continuation of this kind of work that I think is helpful to the broader social issue you decide to take on, and to the audience of consumers who are demanding it more and more, and also to the employee base, in an environment where there's a real hunt for talent, that people want to feel good about where they work and who they work for and what it stands for, that we are seeing such an investment in more social issues and diversity and equity that is really necessary for these times that we're living in.
Paramount owns and operates some of the most iconic media brands, from CBS to MTV, Comedy Central. Obviously, each has very different audiences. How have you been able to leverage these platforms to communicate on sensitive societal and political issues? And what do you have to keep in mind when you're thinking through which issues to engage on and which ones to maybe monitor?
That is a great question. As you said, the MTV Entertainment Group is 9 brands with really distinct and different audiences. Some of the ones that you mentioned, MTV, VH1, Comedy Central, but also CMT and Paramount Network. And one of the really fun parts of the work that I get to do in building campaigns that leverage the power of our brands and the shows and the talent to educate, engage, and empower people to take action is thinking through how it needs to be different depending on the brand and the audience. So, for example, we have done some work to address the clear changes to our environment that we've seen. And I relish the opportunity to figure out what's the starting point of where our audience is coming from, depending on whether or not we're going to be communicating about it from the MTV younger audience or an older audience that might be watching TV Land, or a more conservative audience that might be watching CMT, and figuring out how we have the same North Star, but chart a different path for how to bring people to understand the issue and what work can be done to address a social issue that affects everybody, no matter what brand you might be subscribing to at the moment. And I think that's a really similar part of lessons learned in politics. That is something that is true whether you work in politics or for an advocacy organization on a specific issue, or for a brand or a company, is that there's an art of persuasion, of meeting people where they are and selling them a product, whether that is a person to vote for, or an idea to believe in, or an actual product, or a show to watch, or something to buy. And I think it's really exciting to know, like, there's a lot to be sold when it comes to changing our world and making people's lives better, and that everyone has a role to play, whether you're working in a nonprofit, as I have in the past, or working for a company, as I do now, in engaging people to do better for the world that we all share.
I find that so interesting, and part of the fun of our job, right, is to think through the different audiences and how they may be coming to the table. I'm really curious, given your role, about Gen Z. Our most recent report, The New Cascade of Influence, explored how Gen Z is at the forefront of belief-driven buying and brand advocacy. In fact, we found that 70% of Gen Z are involved in a social or political cause, and 62% want to work with brands to address societal issues. I imagine you are thinking about Gen Z constantly as a result. How have you seen companies and brands, including your own, successfully work with this generation? And what should CCOs and CMOs keep in mind when they think about Gen Z?
Yeah, well, I'll highlight one specific example of what we've been able to do to engage younger people who, as your research shows, are already engaged and are truly hungry for opportunities to create change. You mentioned this in my intro, but in the spring of 2020, which is, I know, a place we don't usually want to go back to, those early days and weeks and months of a pandemic. I was working on behalf of MTV and Comedy Central, and especially on the MTV side, a really strong legacy of civic engagement campaigns. A lot of people think MTV and Rock the Vote are one and the same. And I think that's the result of a really strong partnership that started 30 years ago. Rock the Vote just just for the record, is its own 501c3 nonprofit, but one that we've worked with over the years. We could see in those early days of the pandemic and the first primaries of the 2020 election that we were facing a crisis. Poll workers who have traditionally been older were very understandably not coming to work the polls in states across the country. And the result that we could see in the news were that election administrators across the country were forced to shut down polling locations because they didn't have enough people to work at them. And we know that when you don't have enough poll workers, you don't have enough polls, and that leads to people traveling further, longer lines, and really the disenfranchisement of Americans, and more likely working people, parents, people who don't have flexible schedules, people who can't prioritize voting if it isn't made easy. And so we, along with a number of other partners from the corporate world, from nonprofits, came together to found Power the Polls, a first-time campaign to recruit a new generation of younger, healthier, and more diverse poll workers to stand up our democracy, to make sure that we could have a safe and well-run, fair election so that everybody's voice could be heard in November. And that's just what we did. And we did that from, the suite of brands that I work with at the MTV Entertainment Group. In particular, the one I'll call out that I think was really a key factor in making sure we recruited enough people and enough young people was being able to leverage The Daily Show and Trevor Noah's voice of leadership to reach people and say, we need you younger people, healthier people, to step up and make sure our democracy works. And we did that. We recruited more than 700,000 people. And for all of the, whatever complications came in November in that election, one of them was not that it didn't work, that voting didn't work. We were fully staffed. The team worked really closely with election administrators across the country. And there were so many hundreds of companies and brands who gave their employees time off. There's a lot of companies that give people time off to vote, but also giving people time off to work the polls was a real step up for that time. And we actually are doing it again this year, recognizing that the pandemic is not over, but also that this was a movement that needed to be built beyond the pandemic of it all, and that having enough people work the polls who speak different languages, who are tech savvy, is good for democracy. It's good for bringing Gen Z in. And so that's a really specific example of something that I've been able to lead and will continue to do and work with other companies and brands. But for CCOs and CMOs thinking right now about what they can do, I think there is always an opportunity to engage with other companies or nonprofit organizations to create change and to speak to your audience, whether that's through your social media platforms, through brand email lists, like whatever product it is that you put out into the world. There's a list of things to think through that you could do, and they might not all be right. But I think imagining the broad options and then figuring out what is right for you, your company, your brand, and your consumers and your employees is something that we can all do, and that I know we are hungry for at a time when it can feel like there's so many problems that we can play a role, and that doesn't only need to come from the nonprofit or the public sector or government.
I love that. And I think that's such a great message to close on. If there are companies that want to be part of Power the Polls, how can they find out more?
Absolutely. Well, we are recruiting partners right now at powerthepolls.org. And we'll be happy to bring people on and help imagine those ways that companies can play a role, that organizations can play a role in reaching people on that issue of, standing up our democracy and making sure that voting is easy and accessible for everyone. I will also note that we are having a National Poll Worker Recruitment Day on August 16th, which is a bit earlier than a number of the other markers in the civic engagement calendar. People have brands and organizations rally around National Voter Registration Day and Vote Early Day. The date to really focus on recruiting poll workers is first in that calendar, in part because it's a real job that we hope to sign people up to do, but that individuals need to be trained by their local election administrators to be poll workers. And I will say, as someone who not only helped to come together with other partners to found Power the Polls, I also became a poll worker. I've been a poll worker a couple of times now since 2020. And I will tell you that there are, even as someone who's worked in politics and done my fair share of phone banking and canvassing, there's something really special about coming together in the wee hours of the morning, usually like 5 or 5:30, with a group of neighbors who you likely don't already know at your local elementary school, which is where my polling location is. But some people, it's a library or a firehouse, to really, stand up a polling location and make it possible for yourself, your family, your neighbors to vote. And as it's a really inspiring activity that I would encourage anyone to do if you can take the time to do it yourself, and or to encourage your employees, your colleagues to get involved this way.
That's so great. Thanks so much for joining us. You inspire me daily. I am sure you have just inspired our listeners as well. We're so thrilled that you were able to come on the show and share your insights and expertise. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to Trust Makers.
Thank you for tuning into the Trust Makers, an Edelman podcast in partnership with Advertising Week, where we speak with leaders and other trust builders across institutions. See you next time.